I'm at Todd's place and we're asking, how tight should a scabbard be on a sword blade? Hey folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria and
Todd of Todd's Workshop and Todd Cutler.
Great, so I'm over at Todd's place today shooting a few things, and we got to talking about how tight should a scabbard be on a sword. And we're not only going to talk about medieval swords here, but more on that in a minute. And by coincidence, it turns out that the other day Todd filmed a video on that exact same topic.
So there's a fair chance actually that by the time Matt's video comes out, my one will have been out a day or two.
So we thought, well, you know, let's do a kind of an appendix to that. Let's talk a bit about the findings. And, you know, it's pure coincidence. But this is a topic that's been preying on my mind a bit recently, because I've seen in sword reviews a lot of people criticising swords that come out of scabbards too easily. And I've got some thoughts on that. But first of all, Todd, what are your thoughts on this question?
Well, like I said, there's a, I don't know, 15-20 minute film about it, go watch it. But
I'll put the link below, by the way.
It's kind of a complicated question, because the way I approached it is, certainly in the modern world, you know, we all love it when you get, I don't know, anything that goes into something else and it goes in with a little satisfying click right at the end, and it makes you feel warm inside and lovely, and you think, oh, nice quality.
It's a bit like how the car door sounds when you slam it.
Yeah, exactly that. And there's an amazing amount of work, in fact, you know, literally with psychologists and sound engineers and stuff to make car doors sound good. It's ridiculous, but they do. And it's the same sort of thing with this, that, you know, if you bought a sword and you bought a scabbard and it went in and it was just like rattly, you think, oh, that's rubbish. But actually, is that what you want? And historically, you know, we have done a whole series of films recently, actually, again, sort of largely by chance. Historically, the things that you think you know and the things that you think they intuitively want, they might not necessarily have done so. So my argument on this is, this one here, lovely, doesn't come out. This was actually the one right at the end of my last film that you saw. And this is 2 days after that little clip that I did. And it's now resized itself to the sword, so it's much easier to get out than it was in the clip I showed you. Doesn't come out. But you get wet, you go raining. This is England, for goodness sake, it's Northern Europe. You go riding for 2 days in January. Everything is going to be soaking wet. And then what happens? And that's my feeling on it, is if it's beautifully tight, it's lovely, then what?
And I think the question is also different depending on what is the scabbard made of and what type of sword it is. So, you know, what we've got here is a wood-lined, leather-covered scabbard, which is traditional in medieval Europe. If we go forward a bit into the Renaissance, we often get leather scabbards that don't have a wooden core to them, with rapiers and things like that. If we go to Japan, we've got wooden saya or scabbards which don't have any leather covering over them, and
but at least they're lacquered, so they're probably relatively waterproof, except for the throat.
That's true, but they're chunkier wood, so they're not such thin slats as this. It's a different kind of construction, it's a different type of sword. They're not flexible in the way that European blades and scabbards are. They're stiff. And the scabbards and the swords are stiff and thick. And then equally, if we come forward into the kind of industrial age, we get eventually to, first of all, leather scabbards with brass or steel fittings on them, and then to steel scabbards. Completely different thing again, completely watertight, but completely stiff.
Although, just stopping, if we go back in time again to sort of Saxon Viking eras, then scabbard construction was actually different again, and it was often made of two slats on both faces, which may or may not have been lined with fabric, or very often with short cropped fur. That has a great advantage, that it doesn't bind the blade, and perhaps actually, you know, Viking races coming from somewhere which is, you know, even wetter than England often.
Absolutely.
Perhaps that was part of it. But yes, so those ones are constructed differently, and they don't grip the blade in the way that this does. No. But equally, it holds the blade very securely.
Yeah. And so I've got a feeling, essentially, that within the modern replicating sword world, in the modern kind of sword owning world, a lot of the judgments people make about what's good or bad, and we could extrapolate this to blade finishes and all sorts of things, comes from katanas. Comes from the Japanese sword world.
I've got a theory on this too.
Yeah, and the problem is that we're applying sort of criteria from one culture and one type of weapon to a completely foreign culture, period, everything else, type of weapon, construction. And so my opinion is that a lot of the obsession with how tight a blade is into the scabbard comes from the very precise fit between the habaki at the base of a Japanese katana, wakizashi, tachi, whatever, into the saya, into the scabbard. And this is something that they specifically looked for, and it's connected to the way the sword is made, the way that the saya or scabbard is made, and also the way it's worn as well, and the way you get it out. So with the Japanese sword, certainly if we're talking about a katana, it's worn up high with the edge upwards in a obi or sash horizontally. Now, if you bend over and go like that, it will be very easy to go from a horizontal position to the hilt pointing downwards. So clearly, you don't want a katana or wakizashi that's easily going to keep falling out. That's going to be incredibly dangerous and culturally offensive and everything else. So, and just practical, it's bad terms as well. So you don't want that to happen. Interestingly, there's a parallel in British 19th century swords in that Royal Navy swords, so Royal Navy swords were often carried, okay, in the hand rather than worn. And equally, you're often climbing in and out of boats and ships, and the sword can end up pointing downwards. And so for that specific reason, we have a folding section on the inside of the guard that locks onto the scabbard. You only need that because if it didn't have that and you did this, the sword would fall out. So therefore, ergo, they're not being tightly gripped in the scabbard. You need an additional catch. And in fact, there are police swords which have a catch on for a completely different reason, and that's so that prisoners can't take the sword out from the arresting police constable and use it on the policeman without getting to the little catch. And funnily enough, if we go forwards to the Second World War, Japanese swords also have a spring catch for similar reasons, but also for practical, because you don't want it to fall out when you're charging around the jungles of Burma. So, there are lots of sword types where they had an additional catch or mechanism to keep the sword in the scabbard, because just the scabbard by itself would allow it to fall out. But equally within Japanese culture, they have, because you do hope for a tight fit between the sword and the scabbard, you specifically put your thumb on the underside of the guard to break, and it doesn't actually work with this, but to break the seal of the habaki on the inside of the saya. Once you've broken the seal, then you can do your immediate attack from the scabbard, which is famously done in iaido. So the first thing you do is pop that seal, then you draw the sword and attack with it in one motion. So where does that leave us with European swords? Well, the funny thing is we've got these quick draw attack things in European treatises. We find it in Fiore, we find it in Vardi, various other treatises, where someone attacks you with a dagger and you immediately want to get your sword out of the scabbard. The problem is, if you've got a really tight fit, you can't do that. And the way they're hung, you'll pull the whole belt system with it as well. So.
Well, I think there comes down to little misconceptions about these things as well, because if the sword is loose, and if you go running, it might bounce up and down. Well, okay, it is a 32, 36-inch blade. I think the chance of it actually coming out is relatively slim. But the thing is, anybody who's actually run wearing a sword scabbard knows that you have to hold the sword scabbard down anyway, because the thing's bouncing around so much. So you're trying to solve a problem that isn't a problem. You're trying to solve a problem which is the sword will fall out if I run. Well, you put your hand on it anyway. Yeah. You know, when was the last time you did handstands in armour?
And you tend to hold it at the top there as well.
Yeah, you just put your hand on the hilt and you run. And it's the same with daggers as well, that they're often worn on a thong. And that's a whole other story, because it's kind of a slightly intuitively weird thing to do it. But they're often worn on a thong. And again, if you go running with that, it's bouncing everywhere and there's a chance of you losing it. You put your hand on it. It's just what you do.
And there's also this difference where if we look at how certain swords are worn in the Far East, I spoke about the katana being worn up here, but even if we go to the tachi, which is worn by slings down here with the edge downwards, it's still quite a horizontal position. Mongol and Chinese swords are often worn in quite a horizontal position. So in that case, it's possible that they did want tight scabbards because they were so close to horizontal, they could easily go below horizontal and fall out.
I'll tell you what though, Katzbalgers.
Yeah.
Because Katzbalgers, so the German famous Landsknecht sword, quite a short sword, but very often worn pretty much horizontally.
Horizontal, yeah.
So actually that's an interesting one I hadn't considered. So it's true with a hand and a half or a long sword, or a single-hander, which is slung at an angle or even vertical. But actually, Katzbalger, we're into slightly more Japanese territory with that.
But then thinking about, you know, looking at these treatises that I work with, looking at quick drawing either an arming sword or a long sword that is usually worn at 45 degrees with the point downwards, or sometimes completely vertical like that on the side. If you want to be able to quickly get the thing out, ideally you don't want to have the left hand involved. Now, theoretically, if you get both hands to it, it doesn't really make any difference because you pull the two things away from each other and you can get it out fairly quickly. But if you can only get one hand down because this hand is holding, for example, a shield or a buckler or whatever else, and you want to be able to pull this out, if the scabbard's too tight on the sword, you're going to be losing vital split second or even seconds while your opponent's attacking you with a dagger or whatever else. So
well, that reminds me of a very interesting conversation that we had about the sword breaker dagger. So I took it down to your fight school one time, and we were looking at how to use it. And one of the things that hadn't occurred to me at all, because I don't really sword fight, is that the teeth on the back just slow the blade and disrupt the thinking, the expectation of the person landing the blow on the teeth. It doesn't even have to trap the blade, it just slows it and diverts it, and it makes the sword do something different. And the guy who was using it was saying even like 0.1, 0.2 of a second suddenly can give you that advantage, that change. And it's the same, that if you come to this and you've had this sword for a year and you know exactly what it does and you pull it with the force that you need to pull it, and now suddenly it's not doing it because it's jammed in a bit, that 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 of a second can be enough to change life.
And you know, I often read historical accounts, as you guys know, and there is one account that I've read, I think it was from the Indian Mutiny, but it's definitely from India, mid-19th century, and it literally describes a guy with a talwar in the scabbard. Now, interestingly, Indian scabbards are made very similarly to medieval European scabbards. They are thin wood slats with leather sewn over the top, usually donkey leather. And in that specific situation,
I learned something. Thank you. Brilliant.
Well, they didn't want to use pigs or cows, so they used these donkey. And so it specifically describes that the scabbard had got wet, and the guy went to pull his talwar out. It got stuck. It literally wouldn't come out, and he got bayoneted or you know, stabbed. I can't remember exactly what happens, but he gets killed purely because his scabbard was wet. And this was one of the arguments. So a lot of people criticise steel scabbards because they could, if they didn't have a lining in them, they could blunt the blade. They were loud because they jangled and slapped against the stirrups and all other sorts of things. Lots of downsides to steel scabbards, but at least you couldn't get your sword stuck in them because they didn't swell up, and you know, they didn't have these problems with water that these do.
But you know what I would like to say for the benefit of balance is we don't actually know this for a fact. This is speculation on our part, but we haven't really actually spoken about this before, but obviously we're pretty much in agreement. However, my gut feeling, the testing that I did in that other film, which you haven't seen yet, but it just shows that definitely this kind of scabbard construction, getting wet, is an issue if the blade is too tight. Was it loose and baggy? Don't know. Would I expect it to be loose and baggy? Yes, I would. Yeah,
and so the concluding view, my opinion as it currently stands, and I'm always willing to change my opinions,
absolutely,
is currently that with non-Japanese swords, when we're reviewing them, I personally do not mind at all if I turn it upside down if the sword falls out. And the simple reason is because for me, most of the swords I'm reviewing and looking at are of types which are worn with the pommel upwards. And for me, a greater priority is being able to get it out quickly, if needs be with only one hand, and something that's too stuck in the scabbard and requires too much play to get out and is too tight is actually a bad thing. So hence, I never really, in my reviews, I never criticise a sword that if I do that and it falls out, well, I think that probably did happen with lots of swords historically in the medieval period. And I think, you know, I mean, I think a lot of times scabbards weren't necessarily fitted that well to the swords that sat in them historically. Well,
I've looked at this again in a couple of those films that I've done, and there seems to be quite a lot of evidence that knives and scabbards were not always sold together. And there's probably an expectation that the same would be true of the swords, because if you want a sword scabbard that fits that sword beautifully. Well, of course it's possible, and of course if you're high ranking, you know, these things are possible. But what you would have to do as a cutler, you've now assembled your swords, you now send 30 swords off to the scabbard maker or whatever it may be, and one person will be doing the wood, and then they'll be shipped off to the cordwainer who'll be doing the leather work. So that goes, your shipment of 30 swords is now going to 2 other places, all of which have a lack of security. Your goods, your 30 expensive swords, are now in other people's care. You know, it's not just because we do it now doesn't necessarily mean that they did it then. So it's entirely plausible that you take your sword, you go to the scabbard maker and you go, yeah, it's good enough, that'll do.
And like we both talked about recently about the expectations of consumers in the medieval period as opposed to now, I think that, like you say, all of the evidence that I've seen suggests that when we look at fit and finish of things, suggests that good enough was usually good enough.
Yeah. No, I think it was. It's just so very alien to us, because I will come back all the way to the beginning of this discussion. There is nothing quite so lovely as getting your sword and going, it makes you feel good. Was it like that?
And I don't think we should criticise that, because we are modern people living in the modern world and we're modern consumers. So,
well, actually, this is interesting. This is a slightly different construction technique. So this scabbard here is actually for the same sword, but it has a liner at the top here that just comes in on the rein flap, and it does something really quite different. So actually just swap that over. So, and in fact it's got a bronze edging to it if you flip it around to camera. But and
do it close.
And so now if you pop that sword in, something slightly different happens here, because the leather in the rein flap lining actually binds to the blade, but the rest of the scabbard can still be loose, but you've removed all of the rattle, and it gives you that loveliness. But actually it's a loveliness that's 1.5 millimeters thick, and if it gets wet you'll overcome that, because it'll be almost no resistance.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that one does grip, but when you start to pull it then it comes out fairly easily. So it's, so again, maybe it's even more subtle than just tight or not tight that we're explaining. Sometimes there is a way of gripping, and I think probably this little sort of, I don't know what you call that, but the way it comes up around the guard, that provides an extra bit of friction on that guard. It's not enough friction to stop it when you start pulling it, but it's just enough to sort of keep it in place, isn't it? So yeah, there's very subtle ways you can achieve the goal without it being overly tight on the whole thing.
But again, it just comes back to that infuriating thing about history, is this was done, and we can speculate all we want. We will never know what that's about, really.
Sadly, not.
It's just a thing that they did. You know.
So there we go. I think, you know, no great conclusions, but we've expressed a lot of our views and experiences on this topic, and I think it's a topic which we shouldn't be too black and white and absolute on. I think there's variables essentially, and you have to remember that there's a huge variety, even within just the medieval period in Europe. There's a huge variety in scabbard types and the ways that they were worn, and which we've talked about in the past. Yeah, and all of these things. So always have an open mind, and don't always think that something's bad because it's a little bit looser than you're used to or a little bit tighter than you're used to. It might just be for different purposes, constructed in a different way or worn in a different way. Thanks for coming on, Todd.
Absolute pleasure,
always. And check out Todd's video, link below if you haven't done already, but I'm sure you probably have anyway. And hopefully we'll both see you back on the channel and on Todd's channel really soon. Cheers, folks.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.